CJSW acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation within Alberta, including Nose Hill Métis District 5 and Elbow Métis District 6. CJSW 90.9 FM is located on the University of Calgary campus, which is situated on land northwest of where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, a site traditionally known as Mohkinstsis to the Blackfoot, Witchespaw to the Stoney Nakoda, and Gusitsi to the Tsuut'ina. Welcome to Calgary and the SDGs, a special podcast series made by Calgary Catalyst in collaboration with CJSW. This series explores how Calgary connects to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, known as SDGs for short, through local perspectives and the real-world impact of actions in our city. In each episode, our host Josephine is joined by a distinguished guest from the field, offering insights on the goals shaping our city's future. Now let's dive in. Sustainable Development Goal number 15, Life on Land.
Today, we are discussing about Goal 15, Life on Land. To discuss this topic, we have with us another special guest. Her name is Danah Duke. She is the Executive Director of Miistakis Institute, a Calgary-based nonprofit working on conservation and research to support sustainable landscape and ecosystem. Thank you so much for being here today, Danah. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So before we start off, I wanted to understand a little bit in depth about the work you do and about the work the Institute do. And what is the meaning behind the name of the Institute? It's very unique.
Yes. Well, the Miistakis Institute has been around for over 27 years. We're a not-for-profit charitable organization that focuses on applied conservation research. So all of our work at Miistakis is really about getting information into the hands of decision makers so that they can use it in support of conservation. Our name, Miistakis, is a Blackfoot word, and it means backbone of the world to the Blackfoot people. And so when Miistakis was first formed, we were centered around a geographical area, which is southwestern Alberta, southeastern British Columbia, and northern Montana, an area now known to the Blackfoot people as Miistakis. And so since that time, our work has broadened beyond that geographical focus, but we're very proud to have that name.
That is very wonderful, and very happy to know about the meaning behind that name. So could you tell us more in depth about the kind of work it does on a day-to-day basis, and a little bit more about Goal 15, Life on Land, because it's a very new topic to me personally, and I also think it's very new to so many audiences listening to us today.
Sure. So like I said, all of our work about Miistakis is about, getting information into the hands of decision makers, but it's information that can really support making decisions to support a healthy environment. And so all of our work at Miistakis is really about addressing biodiversity, ecological connectivity, so keeping landscapes connected, and nature-based climate adaptation. And so that's really how we're using nature to make sure we can adapt to climate. And so I would say that all of our work at Miistakis is in alignment with Goal 15, which is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably managed forests, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. So all of our work at Miistakis is really about addressing Goal 15.
And that's a huge scope of work, and it's really wonderful that we are going to talk about it more in detail. So our next question here is to understand what's Calgary's landscape and biodiversity is like.
Sure. We're really fortunate here in Calgary. We are in a city, but we're in a city that's rich in biodiversity. And that has to do with because of where we're located. We're located in these ecosystems that, it's this transition from the foothills to prairie grasslands. We have these river systems running through our city. We have aspen forests, we have grasslands. And so the result of that is we have a lot of biodiversity. And we're very fortunate to live in a city that's so biodiverse. And it's this biodiversity that also then contributes to providing lots of ecosystem services that Calgarians depend on. And whether that's for food we eat, for clean water, for recreation, for adapting to climate. So that's why it's really important that we maintain our biodiversity. And, it's well known that we're in a biodiversity and climate crisis. So it's really important that, we think of all the strategies and how we can make sure that we're maintaining biodiversity within the city and outside of the city as well.
So since this is a city rich and surrounded by a good biodiversity, I'll edit that. Since we are a city surrounded by such rich biodiversity, could you tell us a bit more about the challenges that we face in terms of this richness?
Sure. Living in an urban environment, we have challenges with residential development. And so while we have lots of green spaces in the city of Calgary for wildlife to live in and wildlife to move around, we're continually developing. And so we have to think about and be mindful about as we develop, we build new houses, we build commercial developments, how that's having an impact on habitat and habitat connectivity. We also have climate change, which is having an impact on increasing extreme weather events that we're experiencing here in the city. It's something that everyone in Calgary is well aware of. And we have to think about how we're adapting to that climate. We have really healthy water that flows through our river systems, but that water is impacted by what we're doing upstream of the city of Calgary. So we have to think also outside the borders of the city of Calgary. We have to think broader. We have to look at, how are we sustainably using our forests, our agricultural practices, all of our industrial development. How is that impacting the areas surrounding Calgary as well?
Could you give us, thank you for highlighting that. Could you give us thank you for highlighting this. Could you give us any case study or a particular subject on how this has affected our biodiversity?
Sure. Miistakis, we've been undertaking a biodiversity study here in the city of Calgary for over 5 years now. It's called Calgary Connect, because the most important thing is if we're going to, maintain our biodiversity, we have to know what biodiversity do we have. And so Miistakis, over the last 5 years, we've placed remote cameras. So there are cameras that we've put up in all of our Calgary parks that take images of wildlife as they're using these areas. And so over the last 5 years, we've taken over 200,000 images of wildlife in the city. And it's allowed us to learn a lot about what biodiversity we have in the city, how these wildlife are using the city, how they're moving in and out of the city. And we've learned a lot from that study, which then helps the city of Calgary in their management of wildlife. And so we're learning things like how humans and wildlife interact and coexist, because that's something that's really, we have to think a lot about in an urban environment, is how humans and wildlife coexist. Because we all like to see wildlife, but there's also conflict with wildlife, whether that's with, sometimes we've had, bears in the city of Calgary that are accessing garbage, which then can, of course, cause conflict with humans. Or we have, we often have deer in our neighborhoods as well. And we've been seeing an increase in animals like bobcat, where we're seeing more and more bobcat that are using areas in the city, which can lead to conflict as well. And so through this study, we're learning which animals are using what parks. We're looking at what time of the day the animals are using the parks in relation to when humans are using parks. And as much as it's teaching us a lot about wildlife behavior, it teaches us a lot about human behavior. And often that's one of the key management strategies is human behavior. It's how we have to think about as humans, how our activities impact wildlife.
So I guess it comes to how do we coexist with each other?
Absolutely.
So out of curiosity, I wanted to understand, why do you think or what could be the cause behind more and more animal sightings in the human areas?
More animals coming into human areas?
Yes.
Well, I think it's because some animals take advantage of what being close to humans affords, whether that's security, because some animals will come into areas where they're humans because their predators won't, and so they can have a sense of security being in areas, or sometimes they're accessing food resources, whether that's our plants in our gardens or our bird feeders or garbage. And so we really have to be mindful about how we're, storing garbage or what plants we're planting in our gardens to avoid putting attractants out that are going to attract animals into areas that we don't want them.
This sounds like a very mindful exercise.
Yes.
So moving on to our next question, we spoke about some of the challenges. Could you also highlight some of the conservation efforts that's been happening in Calgary?
Sure. There's a lot of things going on. The city of Calgary itself does a lot to address maintaining habitat for wildlife, maintaining green spaces, maintaining healthy landscapes. The city of Calgary has a biodiversity strategy that they've been implementing, which really focuses on maintaining habitat, maintaining green spaces, maintaining healthy wildlife populations, and really also educating the public on the importance of biodiversity. The city also does a lot to manage invasive species. So, while we have lots of areas and parks that unfortunately have a lot of invasive species, which can often take over and have big impact on ecosystems. So the city does a lot of work in managing invasive species. And then Parks manages all of the green spaces and parks in Calgary, and they maintain those parks to provide wildlife habitat, whether that's in the wetland areas or more terrestrial habitats as well. And there's also the city also maintains, they look at their urban forests, recognizing the importance of urban forests, and especially with climate change impacts. It's really important in the city for us to have healthy urban forests. They provide lots of ecosystem services to an urban environment, and especially with things like heat island effect, which is when you have areas in the city that experience these extreme heat events, that having healthy canopy cover in the city is really important, where it provides shade for people and cooling in cities.
That is extremely important. So we spoke about some of the challenges and conservation efforts, and we are moving on to the next topic. It is sustainable land use. So could you tell us something more about this sustainable land use? What is some of the planning, and what are some of its impact on the economy and nature?
Sure. Sustainable land use planning is really key to maintaining biodiversity, and it's an area that we focus a lot on at Miistakis, is that while we do a lot of research on wildlife and what areas are important for wildlife to be moving, what's really important is that information gets integrated into planning, into municipal planning, and what we're finding is that a lot of times it doesn't. That a lot of times municipalities are often faced with different development proposals, and there's not a lot of consideration for things like ecological connectivity, which is where on their landscape are the areas that are most important to maintain for wildlife movement and for the connectedness of ecosystems. And so we do a lot of work at Miistakis, working with municipalities to identify those places, whether that's in land use frameworks, and those are provincial planning or municipal development plans, or area structure plans, working with municipalities to try to find ways to integrate this information about the importance of maintaining habitat and maintaining connections for wildlife within planning. We need to be thinking about, especially in an urban environment like Calgary, as the city grows, how do we want it to grow so that we can maintain areas for wildlife? And we have to be really thinking about that, not once a subdivision or a development is already in place, but during the planning process itself.
You're listening to Calgary and the SDGs, a podcast focusing on how Calgary connects to relevant United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. You're currently listening to an episode focused on SDG Goal 15, Life on Land. To find this and more episodes, go to cjsw.com or the CJSW app.
Thank you for highlighting that. So as we try and get a sense of what sustainable land use is about, what conservation looks like in Calgary, out of curiosity, I do wanted to ask you a little bit more about the technology and innovation in this space. So we see that a lot of technical innovations have been happening right here in Calgary on the sustainable energy and carbon emissions on those sites. So from the biodiversity perspective, especially on conserving the ecosystem, what are some of the technical advancements or innovations that you see and some of the strategies that the Institute uses?
Well, some of the advances we've seen have been that help our research, and whether that's with some of the remote cameras we use AI to help us classify these images, because you can imagine living in a city with over 1 million people. When we have this many cameras out on the landscape, we get thousands and thousands of images of people, which we're not interested in. We don't want necessarily, we're interested in them from a data point perspective, but we need to delete all those images of people. And so we rely on AI to help us classify images, and that's really enhanced our ability to process thousands and thousands of images. We do a lot of technical spatial modeling at Miistakis, which really helps us think about how the landscape is connected and identify critical areas for movement and how we keep landscapes connected. And there's always advancements in, computer modeling that help facilitate that.
It's interesting that you mentioned AI. AI has been a huge impact in so many fields, and I'm happy that to hear about its impact in the biodiversity space as well, especially about what we do in the city of Calgary. So thank you for mentioning that and highlighting it.
Well, I will add to that about AI. What we did a really interesting study just this past year with we worked with some Mount Royal University students, where they looked at because we know from our Calgary Connect project using remote cameras that we're seeing this increase, like I mentioned, of bobcats in the city. And bobcats can be recognized individually from their spots on their fur. And we've worked with some Mount Royal students to try testing different AI approaches to how our images can be used to start to try to identify individual bobcats, because that can tell us a lot about population levels of bobcats. Like, for instance, are we just seeing the same bobcats on a number of cameras over and over again, or are they all individual bobcats? Because that can help us tell the story a bit more about what the actual population of bobcats is doing. And so we're still testing that now. It's something we hope to develop more so we can learn more information about that.
That's interesting. This reminds me of the National Geographic documentaries where they would follow the specific animals and they would have a name for it, and they follow their entire life cycle. So this is very fascinating to know how we keep a track of these animals. So my next question is about the next major part of what the Institute does. So I understand that one part of it is about conservation and research. The other part is also about engaging community in the work that you do. So could you talk to us a little bit more about the community engagement initiatives, and especially with the Indigenous people?
Sure. We recognize the importance of engaging people in these dialogues and engaging people in understanding the importance of biodiversity and connected landscapes. And One area that we do a lot of work in at Miistakis, because we feel it's very effective in engaging communities, is we do a lot of work with citizen science. And so that citizen science is a way to really engage a community in collecting information, but it also, increases their knowledge on a topic as well. And so we've had a number of really successful citizen science initiatives. We've done a lot having to do with wildlife movement across roads, where we engage people in helping document where they see wildlife crossing roads, and they've been able to submit that information using different mobile apps. And we're able to use that information then to help identify the areas along a road that are most important for wildlife crossing. But then it engages a community in the topic of the importance of areas for wildlife movement. And so, for example, we had a citizen science initiative down in southwestern Alberta for a number of years. It ran for 5 years, and it allowed us to collect a really valuable data set on identifying areas along Highway 3 that are most important for wildlife to cross the road. But it engaged an entire community on this topic that still remains exceptionally active in the topic of wildlife movement and in the importance of keeping landscapes connected.
That is very interesting also to know, because every time we go over to the mountains, or when we see boards saying that this passage is for animals crossing, so you need to be careful. So it is nice to know that behind the scenes about how this all takes place, what's the work done, how do they alert us. So thank you for highlighting that. So we are coming to the last couple of questions. So my next question is about, is there any rehabilitation kind of work that's been done in terms of conservation, the biodiversity in Calgary?
Yes, there's lots. There's a lot of work done on restoring and improving wetlands. Wetlands are really important for biodiversity, for filtering our water, for storing water. And there's a lot of work being done in the city on wetlands. It's an area that Miistakis does a lot of work in terms of identifying which wetlands should be prioritized for restoration. An area that the city and Miistakis and other groups have been really trying to promote are some of these more nature-based solutions. And one of them that we work a lot on is promoting coexistence with beavers. And beavers are a species that are really important for creating wetland habitat. There are a lot of beavers in the city of Calgary, but they're a species that also can cause a lot of conflict with humans because they take down prized trees, and their damming activity can cause flooding. And so there's been a lot of work done in the city of Calgary to really improve how we coexist with beavers, and that includes putting in their devices called pond levelers. And so they get put in at a beaver dam, and what it does is it just regulates the water level to prevent flooding. Or you can also, there's other devices there's many of them in the city. They're culvert protectors. So they're just put over the end of a culvert that can prevent a beaver from clogging up a culvert, which is often what beavers do, that often results in flooding. And so this is a nature-based solution. It's really harnessing, the great work that beavers do to create more wetland habitat. And I think it's something that, hopefully we'll see actually adopted more and more across all of Alberta, is really more coexistence with beavers, because they're really so powerful in helping us create wetland habitat that results in all kinds of ecosystem benefits.
This sounds like a win-win approach.
Yes.
So we spoke about beavers, we spoke about bobcats, and so we spoke about deer. So I wanted to know, is there any other animals that we often come in contact with in the city? Is there any other animals that's in play with our regular everyday day-to-day life?
Oh gosh, I mean, the list is really, really long. When our work that we've done on Calgary Connect with looking at biodiversity, it's a really long list of species that we have in Calgary, right from bears and moose and deer and bobcats. and cougars, right down to raccoons and skunks and porcupines. And so, like I said, we're just so fortunate to live in a city with such rich biodiversity, but we have to value it. And I think we have to really, be thinking about and being deliberate about our actions to make sure we maintain that biodiversity, especially as the city grows and especially as we have increasing impacts from climate, and that we have to think about, how do we maintain connections for these wildlife so that they can move in and out of the city and, maintain habitat for the wildlife. I live down near Fish Creek Park, and it's a park that I visit regularly. And every time I'm there, I just think about how fortunate we are to live in a big urban environment like we do, and have access to this kind of biodiversity.
That's that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing about those species. It's always curious and interesting to know about them. So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about what are some of the efforts that individuals like me can do, and also what are some of the efforts that collective business companies and organizations or even people movement can do to become a part of this conservation efforts?
There's lots that people can do. I think that, we're learning about how as humans we use the landscape, and how sometimes there might be places in the city where we have to think about restricting our use as humans, whether that's because it will provide more security for wildlife if they need to access certain habitats either at certain times of the year or certain times of the day. And I think as us as humans, it's something we need to just be aware of, that there may be times when we are restricted in places we can go, and to honor those restrictions. And there's things like in certain communities in the city, we're starting to see strategies of, not putting out our garbage in our recycling bins until the morning of the pickup, because in some communities that's where conflict with bears has happened, because bears have learned that there's a food reward with those garbage bins and recycling bins. And so if they sit out overnight, that increases the chances that bears can access them. And so it's getting people to understand the need for that, and to get into the regular habit of, not putting out those bins until first thing in the morning. And another really big one is dogs off leash in the city. That what we have found with Calgary Connect project is how prevalent it is people walking their dogs off leash in areas where they're supposed to be on leash. And this can often lead for conflict with wildlife. And we're starting to see in our data just this separation of use of like some wildlife that are not using areas of certain parks when there's prevalence of dogs off leash. And so it's just about people. And it's like I said before, it's often about human behavior. And it's really about us really adhering to those guidelines that are put out there by the city to when, where your dog should be on leash.
Been learning a lot from this episode today about our coexisting species. So thank you so much for highlighting all those points. So before I close, I wanted to close it with this question. So you've been heading this institute for so many years now, and you must have come across so many cases and interesting reports and case studies. So what's your most favorite thing about biodiversity in Calgary? And also, what's the one thing that kind of really shook you, that is never... What's the one thing that really shocked you about biodiversity?
Well, I feel I've said this a number of times already, but for me it really is, because I have been to a lot of, conferences, both internationally and nationally, where we talk about biodiversity and we talk about strategies to maintain biodiversity. And in a lot of places, the focus is on restoration because they've lost it. Whereas we have it. We have it here in Calgary, and we have it here in Alberta. And we have to then just make sure we maintain it, but it's much easier to maintain it than it is to bring it back. And so I think that's just so important for Calgarians and Albertans to know, is that we are so fortunate to live in a place in the world where we have this rich biodiversity. And so, but that's not to say it's not without its challenges, and that we are seeing that we're having these impacts to biodiversity, and that we have to, be really active about our strategies to make sure we're maintaining it.
That's wonderful. That wraps up our episode. I've learned so much, and I hope our audience learned so much from this episode too. Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing all your insights. It was such a great pleasure to have you here today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
This concludes this episode of Calgary and the SDGs. To listen back to this conversation and find more episodes from the series covering other SDGs, visit cjsw.com or download the CJSW app.